This video is brought to you by The Perfect Gene. Go to theperfectgene.nyc and use code DAN15 for a special offer, and stay tuned after the video for more info. Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell, and welcome to a special video I wanted to make covering original movies and why we just don't seem to see as many of them anymore. As we covered right here on the channel earlier this week, Horizon: An American Saga recently became the latest big budget original film to fail at the box office, and this isn't a video to say that all original films out there aren't succeeding, but there are fewer and fewer original films that are being made, and the ones that do succeed seem to have a much harder path to success. So I wanted to look at the recent history of original films, their loss in popularity, why studios might have lost faith in them or at least stopped making them, and what audiences can do to help bring them back. And I guess it's a good place to start by saying, what do I mean by an original film? Well, for the purposes of this video, it's a movie that's not a prequel, sequel, or remake, not an adaptation of any sort of pre-existing material like a book or comic book, and a movie that's not based on historical events or people. It is a movie that sprang directly from a writer's mind that is attempting to sell the audience on an entirely original world or concept. Now, having said that, every story is inspired by something, so there are some movies that I'm counting as original, like The Lion King and Frozen, that are heavily inspired by things like Shakespeare and Hans Christian Andersen. And Frozen in particular is a movie that was a very borderline case because it started out its life as a straight adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's The Ice Queen, but didn't really end up there. It was something that was kind of discarded earlier in development, and I understand arguments either way. I'm choosing to count it as original because I think it falls just this side of the line, but that is a difficult thing to parse sometimes. Really what I'm going on is something that is directly adapted or directly based on a pre-existing story, and not something that may have been inspired by elements of a pre-existing story. Let's start by taking a historical look at just how many hit films are original films and how many movies aren't. And we're going to basically divide this into two historical eras, before the year 2000 and then the year 2000 and after. This is a look at the top 50 highest grossing domestic films adjusted for inflation, according to Box Office Mojo, released before the year 2000, and includes some of the most famous and treasured movies of all time. And first of all, let's remove all of the movies from this list that were sequels to pre-existing films. And as you can see, only 5 of the top 50 highest grossing films pre-2000 were direct sequels. The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, The Phantom Menace, which was a newer thing called a prequel, Thunderball, and Goldfinger, so basically Star Wars and James Bond. But now let's get rid of quite a few more by removing everything that isn't an original film as I defined them earlier, movies that are based on or inspired by or a remake of something that came earlier. Now, as you can see, that's a pretty significant chunk, but there are still 14 out of 50 movies left on the list, including sci-fi and fantasy like Star Wars and Independence Day, animated films like The Lion King and Fantasia, comedies like Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop, and Blazing Saddles, and also The Greatest Show on Earth for some reason. And Hollywood has been in love with adapting stories and books and historical events since the beginning of movie making, so it's not really a surprise that so many of those movies aren't, as we defined them earlier, original, but still, 14 out of 50, that's over 25% of the 50 highest grossing films that were released pre-2000 that are defined as original films, and that's not too shabby. Now let's look at the top 50 highest grossing domestic films released in the year 2000 and after, again adjusted for inflation, but this time according to thenumbers.com, because Box Office Mojo decided to stop updating their inflation chart after 2020 for some reason. The explosion of numbers and subtitles here is pretty evident, so let's start with removing all of the films on this list that are direct sequels or prequels to other films. But for films that are inside cinematic universes like the MCU, if the movie's the first film in a series, I'll allow that to remain on the board for now. And this is really our first massive difference. While only 5 of the top 50 highest grossing movies were sequels pre-2000, 32 out of 50 meet that criteria post-2000. That indicates that Hollywood is not only making more sequels, but that audiences are devouring them. Now let's remove all the movies that are adapted from pre-existing source material. And when we do that, that leaves just 4 movies. Only 4 of the 50 highest grossing movies of the 21st century meet the definition of original. Avatar, Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc., and Frozen. And again, depending on how you judge Frozen on a technicality, that could be just 3 out of 50. So in just that jump in time periods, we went from 28% of movies pre-2000 being original films to just 8% post-2000. So how did we get here? Well, when you look at the box office since the 1980s, when box office tracking really began in earnest, you can see that there is a gradual decline in the performance of original films. So I decided to look at every single year since 1980 and see what the highest charting original film was for each individual year. In the 1980s, an original film was one of the 5 highest grossing films of the year every single year. And in 6 out of the 10 years, original movies were number 1, including movies that went on to spawn franchises that have given us recent installments like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Top Gun, and Beverly Hills Cop. And when you look overall at the 1980s, the top ranking original film of the year was at average number 2 among the highest grossing movies of the year. Now let's look at the 1990s. And in the 90s, an original film was only the number 1 movie of the year 4 times: Home Alone, Toy Story, Independence Day, and Saving Private Ryan. And 1992 didn't have an original movie in the top 5 at all, with Sister Act ranking highest at number 6, behind movies like Home Alone 2, Batman Returns, and Lethal Weapon 3. The average year-end rank for an original film slipped to 2.8, nearly 1 full position from the 1980s, and it should be noted that 1998, which saw Saving Private Ryan as the number 1 movie of the year, was the last year to date that an original film was at the top of the yearly box office chart. There was even more slippage in the 2000s. Original films only got as high as number 2 twice with Castaway and Finding Nemo, and they slipped out of the top 5 once and the top 10 one time as well in 2007 when Ratatouille ranked number 11 behind movies like Spider-Man 3, Shrek the Third, Transformers, The Bourne Ultimatum, and 300. We also saw the average yearly ranking for the highest performing original film slip almost 2 spots to an average of 4.7, still in the top 5, but falling quickly. Things changed dramatically in the 2010s. 5 out of the 10 years didn't have an original movie in the year-end top 10, and the highest charting original was, controversially, Frozen at number 3 in 2013. If you want to be technical that year and not count Frozen, then it would have been Gravity at number 6. Originals slipped as low as number 16 twice in the 2010s, with Interstellar in 2014 and A Quiet Place in 2018, and the average yearly ranking for the highest performing original film fell 5 spots to 9.6. Now let's look at how we're doing so far in the 2020s. I didn't include the year 2020 in my calculations because there's no telling what movies like Tenet would have done in a normal theatrical year. The highest ranking original we did get in 2020 was Pixar's Onward at number 7, but for the 4 remaining years that I did count, the highest charting original film is actually this year's If at number 10. Otherwise, no original film has cracked the yearly top 10 domestically this decade, with 2021's Free Guy coming the closest, and the average yearly ranking for the highest grossing original film in the 2020s is 13th. So what we see here is a clear pattern of original films slipping further and further down the top 10 just about every year. And why is that? Well, it's largely because studios have been putting more and more money into big franchises and sequels. And to find out the reason why that's happening, you really have to look at the emergence of the global market in the last few decades when it comes to movies. For this chart, I looked at the 10 highest grossing domestic movies of each decade, adjusted for inflation, and how much of their total worldwide gross came from the domestic box office. For example, in the 1970s, 77.1% of the total worldwide gross for that decade's 10 biggest movies came from the domestic market, the US and Canada, meaning that while international box office was a factor, the business was driven mainly by moviegoers right here in the US. In the 1980s, 66.6% of the worldwide gross for the 10 highest grossing films came domestically, meaning that an average of 2/3 of the money still came from the domestic market, which drove the majority of the business. But everything changed in the 90s, and specifically the mid to late 90s, as Hollywood's blockbuster movies became global blockbuster movies, and massive hits like Titanic, The Phantom Menace, and Independence Day saw as much as 70% of their global business come from international markets. The domestic share of the worldwide gross for those movies dropped to an average of 43.8%, and that number has remained fairly steady ever since. The movies were still being made by Hollywood studios, but they started being sold more and more to everyone in the world. And when you're making movies now for a global audience and not just an American one, studios are going to start thinking about what translates well. What can you easily sell to countries around the world that have a different variety of cultures and and interest. Visual effects is one, spectacle is another, action is another, animation is a big one. And what doesn't translate very well? Well, comedy is one of them, especially comedies that are set in the US and based on US-centric humor, as well as personal dramas and really any idea that you can't easily sell to somebody around the world who's not familiar with it. If you're pushing a worldwide brand, a lot of your marketing is already done because you don't have to educate the moviegoer about what exactly this story or this world is. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule, the most prominent one being Avatar, the highest grossing movie of all time, which was an original movie in that it wasn't directly based off of anything else, but it also had the visual effects and the spectacle that made it appealing to sell to global viewers. It really was a great hybrid of both of those things, but that's not the standard anymore. And when we talk about why Hollywood studios have pushed so hard towards global marketing, you do have to look at the emergence of the global market, of course, and especially China starting in the 90s and going into the 21st century. But you also have to look at what has seemed like an endless run of studio mergers and acquisitions since the 1990s. And here's just a few of them. Back in 1990, the parent company of Warner Brothers became Time Warner, which made it a much bigger conglomerate. Then in 1991, Columbia Pictures was bought by Sony and renamed Sony Pictures. Also in 1991, MCA, the parent company of Universal, was bought by Panasonic. In 1994, Viacom acquired Paramount. And in 1995, Panasonic sold MCA and Universal to another huge multinational company, Seagram. In 1995, Disney acquired the ABC TV network, greatly expanding its reach. And in 2000, Seagram and Universal were sold to an even bigger company called Vivendi. In 2001, Time Warner became AOL Time Warner, one of the biggest corporate blunders of all time. And in 2004, Vivendi sold Universal to GE and NBC, another even bigger company. In 2006, Paramount bought DreamWorks Pictures, and Disney acquired Pixar the same year as it continued to collect brands. In 2008, DreamWorks cut its ties with Paramount, and in 2009, Disney acquired another big brand, Marvel. 2011 saw NBC Universal getting acquired by an even bigger company in Comcast. In 2012, Disney acquired another huge brand in Star Wars. In 2016, Universal acquired DreamWorks Animation. In 2018, Warner Brothers was acquired by AT&T. In 2019, Fox was acquired by Disney. In 2022, Warner Media merged with Discovery to become Warner Brothers Discovery. And just this year, a couple weeks ago, Skydance is officially merging with Paramount Pictures. That deal is pending, but everything says that it's actually going to happen. What you see here is a pattern. Hollywood studios are either being absorbed into huge companies or they're becoming bigger and bigger companies themselves. And every time that happens, the movie studios become a smaller and smaller part of those larger and larger companies. And when you talk about studios that are being owned by conglomerates, you see fewer American conglomerates like Gulf and Western and MCA owning movie studios, and more multinational conglomerates like Sony and Comcast now having movie studios under their banners. And then you have Disney that has remained its own company, but has invested billions and billions of dollars into these worldwide brands that they want to make as much money from as they can. It all boils down to the same thing. The stakes are higher because the companies are bigger and they don't really want to get just a corner in the domestic market. They don't want to make a movie that makes $400 million domestically. They want to make a movie that makes $1.4 billion worldwide. And so they're going to invest their money and they're going to invest their time in these big brands, in these known products, in these things that they feel somewhat confident that people are going to pay money to see. And when you're talking about original films, they don't really fit neatly under that banner. Now, some would say that those dollars haven't been so safely spent, given the numerous high-profile flops of the past few years, and especially last summer. But even given those, the box office results generally speak for themselves. And I've heard many people say right here on the channel and elsewhere that the reason moviegoing is in decline is because studios are only making sequels, prequels, and remakes, and audiences just don't care about them anymore. But when you look at the movies that are actually succeeding, they are mainly sequels, prequels, and remakes. So either that is what audiences actually want to see, or they've just driven away everybody that's not interested in those movies. Either way, all studios have to go on is what people are paying for, and that's largely franchise films. If audiences began to reject all non-original films, then the studios would be forced to innovate a little bit more. But as long as they're the movies that are succeeding the most, then it really starts a vicious cycle. Audiences pay to see non-original movies. Studios decide to make more of them. They give fewer resources to original filmmaking. And when those movies are made, they don't get the same kind of marketing support as the bigger movies do. So fewer people go to see the original films. The studios decide that that's not what audiences want to see. And so they continue to invest more into sequels and franchises, and on it goes. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that all non-original films are bad. Movies like Oppenheimer, Spider-Man No Way Home, the Dune films, Top Gun Maverick, and The Batman have been some of my favorites of the decade so far. And my favorite movie of all time, Jaws, is an adaptation of a novel. But it is sad to see the lack of investment in original films, or the thought generally that they can only be mid-budget movies, maybe your awards contenders at the end of the year. Because as our data showed, it used to be that blockbuster filmmaking and original filmmaking went hand in hand. But that's just not the case anymore. So what can fans of original films do? Well, first of all, if you want to see more movies that don't fit under that non-original umbrella, you can check out more horror films and animated films. Horror is often produced at a sensible budget, and I'd argue that it's the genre that most frequently releases original ideas alongside sequels to established franchises. Some of them are good. Just this weekend, we're seeing a breakout for the original horror film Longlegs, and of course, Hereditary, as you don't need to be reminded, is an original horror film that is also one of my favorite movies of all time. Animation is another area with a sizable investment in original ideas. When you look at the highest performing original films each year since 2000, 10 of the 24 are Pixar movies, and 12 out of the 24 are animated films. Studios like Pixar and Illumination have become bankable global brands unto themselves, which gives them a lot of flexibility to invest in those original ideas. For many, just saying it's a Pixar film is enough to generate interest, and so they can really make a lot more of what they want to make. It's also important to make a distinction between lazy non-original films and good non-original films, because there are some movies that don't fit under that original category that still feature some really strong stories and cutting-edge storytelling techniques. For example, the Spider-Verse movies inside the Spider-Man franchise are great films, and you've got movies based on real events like Titanic that are great movies unto themselves. I mean, the boat sinking may have sold the initial tickets, but it was the love story, I would argue, that made it one of the biggest hits of all time. Non-original doesn't necessarily mean non-creative, so it's important not to write all non-original films off as being derivative. You can still find some very exciting storytelling inside of movies that aren't necessarily original quote-unquote stories. But the most important thing that you as a movie fan can do to ensure that more original films are made is to support original films when they come out. Go see them at the movies. Rent them at home if you want to watch it at home. Stream them on Netflix and Disney+. The economics around the movie industry have changed so much, but the important thing is that you show your support and show these studios that these are the kinds of movies that you appreciate them watching and that you're going to make it worth their while to make. There's not going to be a Christmas Carol-like moment where all of the executives in Hollywood throw open their windows on a snowy day and decide, by gosh, I'm going to start making nothing but original movies. They are going to make the movies that they believe the audience wants them to make, the movies that they think are going to make them the most money. And if the audience is telling them that it's sequels, prequels, and remakes, those are the movies they're going to make. But if you tell them that you want more originality, they'll listen to that too. Because one thing that's been proven time and time again with Hollywood, no matter what decade or era it is, it's that if you vote with your wallet and put cash in their pockets, they'll give you more of what you want. So those are my thoughts on the decline of original films and a few things we can do to help bring them back. What do you think? Are you enjoying more sequels and prequels, or do you want to see more new movies coming out? Let me know down in the comments below. And before we go, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, The Perfect Gene. It's the summer, which means fun and sun, but also a lot of uncomfortable situations for people like me who just like to wear jeans. Sometimes it's the humidity both outside and inside your jeans, leaving you feeling, well, swampy. And sometimes it's a long plane ride or a road trip, which can feel even longer if your jeans are crushing your beach balls. Let's face it, summer's never really been a great time to love jeans. Until now. The Perfect Jean has nailed the solution to all your denim difficulties. Not only are they great looking and perfect fitting, they're also light and stretchy, so you can enjoy the hot weather without creating your own tropical climate. The Perfect Jean wants every guy to look and feel great in their jeans, so they have 6 fits from skinny to thick, with waist sizes from 26 to 50 and lengths from 26 to 38. So they've got the perfect size for you. I was picking out my jeans this morning and I literally dug around in my jeans drawer, making sure that I grabbed my perfect jeans to wear first. They are by far the best fitting and most comfortable jeans I've ever owned, and I've been wearing jeans for a very long time. It's finally time to stop sweating the summer away in uncomfortable jeans by going to theperfectjean.nyc. Viewers and listeners to the show get 15% off your first order, plus free shipping, free returns, and free exchanges when you use code DAN15 at checkout. That's 15% off for new customers at theperfectjean.nyc with promo code DAN15. After you purchase, they're going to ask you where you heard about them, so please support the show and tell them that I sent you. F your khakis and get the Perfect Jean. Thanks to the Perfect Jean for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Be sure to stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.